Our speakers, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, will speak for about half of the session. Then it will be over to you to talk to your neighbours, come up with some thoughts, observations, questions, and then the rest of the session will run based on what we hear from you. So the aim of this session then is to explore the complicated and diverse identities within England. And I don't need to tell you, do I, with what's going on at the moment, with Brexit, with the state of the disunited kingdom, as we've already heard it called this morning, it's a subject which is right at the heart of contemporary politics and contemporary life. So we're asking, what can museums learn from current research into English identity, and how, and if, museums can respond to and shape that current debate? Now, our thanks to Ian Watson, Director of Tyneware Archives and Museums, who proposed this session and brought together our three speakers. And our three speakers today are from outside of the museum world, but they all work on research into English identity. And we thought it'd be really interesting to bring them to come and talk to you and get your reflections back on that. So they're going to talk for about 7 minutes, and I'm going to be quite a fierce chair. So I will wave at you to keep us on time, and then it's over to you. So I'll just introduce our speakers. So our first speaker, Richard Brown, is a research director at the Charity Centre for London. He leads the research and events programme, and he writes and speaks widely on urban economics, housing and government. And before that, he worked at the London Legacy Development Corporation and the Greater London Authority as private secretary to Mayor Ken Livingstone. And he's also previously worked as a journalist. Our second speaker, John Denham, is director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics at Southampton University, and he's also director of the Southern Policy Centre. Formerly a Labour MP for 23 years, a Labour minister and member of the Cabinet from 2007 to 2009. And prior to this, he was involved in the voluntary sector and a local councillor. And Ed Cox is Director of Public Services and Communities for the Action and Research Centre at the RSA, where he is leading a programme of work on people, power, place and inclusive growth. Ed previously led IPPR North for 9 years, where he was a champion for devolution and much of the thinking behind the Northern Powerhouse. And before that, Ed was an advisor to the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. So some fantastic speakers, and I'm going to hand over now to our first speaker, Richard.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. And it's really great to be here to come and have this discussion. I think it's a really important discussion. At Centre for London, our interest is in making London a fair and prosperous city, but in recent years we've become more and more concerned about the fractures opening up between London and the rest of the UK. And we've done work on just that. We've done work on London's role in the wider South East. And we've also done work trying to understand what London identities are. And I'm going to talk today about the nature and extent of people identifying with London, what some of the content of that identity may be, and how it fits with other identities, and then, very briefly, because you're the experts, not me, what some of the implications may be for the museums sector. London's sometimes presented as this cosmopolitan, denatured anywhereville, to use the phrase pioneered by David Goodhart. A place of very loose associations, loose connections, no strong sense of community. But actually, if you look at the research about London as a source of identity, something quite different becomes clear. Recent research has showed about 89% of Londoners identify as Londoners to a greater or lesser extent. And now that's a high figure. I think there are three interesting things about that. One is that that's been more or less constant since 1977, when we looked at a similar survey had been done. So over a 40-year period, when London has been transformed, it's become so much more cosmopolitan, the foreign-born population has more or less doubled, the level of people identifying as Londoners has stayed pretty constant. Other things have changed. The sense of pride in London is much stronger than it used to be. The sense of optimism about London is much stronger than it used to be in the mid-70s. But the sense of identification as Londoners has stayed as strong. Second thing that's interesting, I think, is that there's little variance between voting patterns, between ages, between Brexit opinions as to whether people identify as Londoners. There are some differences, those perhaps stronger between workers and unemployed people, between black and minority ethnic communities who feel more identified with London compared to some other communities. English speakers and non-English speakers, and between homeowners who feel more identified than renters do. But it generally is quite high amongst all those groups. There's not any great group that doesn't feel strongly identified with London. And the third thing is that it seems to have little variance on how long you've actually lived in London. People who've lived for more than 5 years have 86% identification. People who've lived in London for less than that still have nearly 65% identification with London. So it's an identity that's open. It's an identity that people can acquire very quickly. Becoming a Londoner is something that one can do in a matter of a fairly short number of years. But it's also embedded with different identities. It's often seen, I suppose, as London being very much in opposition to a UK identity, or particularly perhaps an English identity. And while London is the English region that has lowest identification as English in the census, most of the people in the survey we looked at, 78% of people felt to a greater or lesser extent that they were English as well as Londoners. So it's quite strongly coextensive with Englishness. It's not obviously in tension with it in terms of how people identify. But it also, of course, has a whole load of other identities embedded within it. Around a third of Londoners pick either being a north, south, east or west Londoner as their dominant identity when they're asked. And for many Londoners, the scale of identification is much smaller. It tends to be on a neighbourhood, something usually smaller than the London Borough, something more like the pre-1965 local government units. So you talk about coming from Battersea, from Bermondsey, from Bethnal Green, not about coming from the London Borough of Wandsworth, Southwark or Tower Hamlets. And that sense of local attachment is particularly strong for newly arrived migrants in London, who tend to experience their local area and then start to extend their understanding of the city. It's less strong for some groups, for example, LGBTQ Londoners, who tend to feel more identification with the city as a whole than with local areas. So those are that's the nature of London's character. It's very London's identity. It's very much embedded. It's very open. It's very easily acquired. People subscribe to it quite strongly. How robust that sense of identity is another question. And I'm going to try and say a few things, slightly more speculatively, just about what the content of London's identity might be, because I think that has a bearing on how it's represented as well. And this is slightly more subjective, because we haven't done detailed research on this. We want to do research on identifying what people see as the big signifiers, but we've not started it yet. I think there's an element of identification with the physical fabric of London. I mean, London, unlike many other regions, has little pretense to be natural. It's almost entirely a made landscape. It's a made cityscape. People feel attachment to their local areas. People feel dislocation when, as is happening across the city at the moment, areas change rapidly. In areas like Elephant and Castle, you're seeing significant change, a whole cityscape being destroyed and remade, and I think that is causing significant dislocation for some communities. I think it's an identity that sometimes feels strongest in moments of triumph and adversity. I think London's identity and London's pride in London was very strong in 2012 during the Olympics. It also sees, I think, a level of resurgence at moments such as during the Blitz, I suppose, if you go back a longer time, or when there have been recent terrorist attacks in London. It identifies a sort of strength of Londoners. It's National Poetry Day today, so I'm going to just quote 2 lines of Noel Coward's London Pride, which I think brings 2 of these elements together. He talks of early rain and the pavements glistening, all Park Lane in a shimmering gown. So bringing together adversity, the built environment, and of course rain. And I think that brings me on to another aspect of London's identity. I think it's quite literary, quite musical, a lot of the aspects of London's identity. It's quite verbal identity. One can think of Blake, one can think of Dickens, Zadie Smith, George Orwell, writers from the 19th century to more modern times. One can also think of punk rock, one can think of carnival, one can think of grime, new forms of expression of London identity, very much rooted in London's communities. And I think that's another aspect, is that it's very tied up with London's nature as a diaspora city. Some of the most powerful songs expressing London identity, powerful songs about London, have, for example, been songs from an immigrant perspective. Songs like London is the Place for Me by Lord Kitchener, one of the Windrush immigrants. Transmetropolitan, a drunken ramble across London by the Pogues. Songs like London by the Pet Shop Boys and the Smiths, looking at the experience of coming to London from big regional cities, coming to London from Eastern Europe. So I think the modern London identity particularly is an identity that reflects and revels in that sense of diaspora. I think the thing that's missing sometimes in London identity, which sometimes is reflected in some of the attitudes shown by an older generation, is that sense of the post-war period. that London of Patrick Hamilton novels and Dearden Ralph films feels quite distant. People talk about Victorian London, the great era of London imperial power, if you like, and they talk about modern London, the post-1960s London. Some of the Londons between that get slightly less thought about. So I think the challenges for the museum sector, I think, are in the various different roles that London plays. It has a challenge itself in playing a role as a capital city as well as a global city, in being a centre for England and the UK as well as a centre for the world. And I think that's one challenge, is how does it represent these different roles in its museums? How do its museums, it has some excellent local and regional museums, including the Museum of London and the Museum in Docklands, that really reflects that international, that migrant history of London. They have a challenge in that they're also facing an international audience, and how do they meet that international audience's need for London history at the same time as telling stories to Londoners and stories to the rest of the UK about how London works as a capital city and also as an English city. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's good to follow Richard. Just a point about national identities, because I'm going to use some data too, but they're not precise things, and data can sometimes give you the idea that things are fixed and precise. A national identity is in fact a collection of stories, narratives, images, histories, events, landscapes, built environments that are important to people. And what makes it a national identity is not that people share exactly the same stories, images, and narratives, but they share enough of them to feel they belong to what Anderson described as an imagined community. So when I use numbers here, they're not perhaps as precise as they sound when I use them. So a few things about Englishness and Britishness across the residents of England. When we go out and ask people how strongly they feel a national identity, about 4 out of 5 people who live in England say they feel strongly English. About 4 out of 5 people who live in England say they feel strongly British. The mathematically sharp amongst you will understand, therefore, that quite a lot of people hold both of those things. So we also ask another question, which is essentially to put people to put themselves on a scale that runs from English, not British, through more English than British, through to more British than English, British, not English, and of course, none of the above, don't knows, and whatever. And that's interesting because that shows that this sharing of identities is spread across the population. In fact, it might be interesting just to ask a couple of those categories. Perhaps you could indicate if you would describe yourself, let's take a broad one, more English than British. That is the people here who feel they are English, not British, or more English than British. How many in that category? I can see a couple of hands, I think. How many people here would describe themselves as more British than English? That is, more British than English or British. Okay, lots of hands go up. In the population of England as a whole, the people who are more English than British is 1/3 of the population. Okay, well, there were 2 hands went up here. 1/3 of the population is equally English and British, and about 1/4 of the population is more British than English, and about 10% don't ascribe to any of those identities. Now, the reason for making that point is not to say that your identities are right or wrong, but it's very easy in identity work to generalize from one's personal identity to assumptions about the population as a whole. For most people who live in England, when they talk about being English, they're talking about us and we, not them. It's very easy to slip into a language where people who identify as British, not English, think of the English as a rather odd group of people, as opposed to there being rather more of them than there are of the people who are British. So what else do we know about these people who emphasize their English identity and who make up 8 out of 10 of the population? By and large, the people who are English are not the people who are in power in England. They tend not to be graduates. People with power tend to be graduates. They tend not to live in the greatest numbers in the cities. That's where the people with power live. They tend not to have gone, as I said, to university. They live in greater density outside the big cities. They're somewhat older. They're more likely to be white than BAME. But interestingly, Englishness is not widely seen as a racial identity. The number of people who think you have to be white to be English has halved in the past 7 years, from 1 in 5 to just 1 in 10 of the population. So despite the rhetoric about Brexit being all about sort of an ethnic Englishness, that is belied by the research that we have. One of the things that's interesting about English identity, though, is that Scottish identity and British identity have had huge engagement from political elites and from the state in producing an inclusive sense of national identity. English identity has had almost no engagement from political leaderships or from the states, or indeed quasi-state organisations, the Arts Council and things of that sort, rarely engage with this issue. So the interesting thing is that Englishness has become more inclusive, but without the engagement of people in leadership positions that other identities have had. But identity has, in the last 20 years, become increasingly salient. So of that third of the population who are more English than British, they were much more likely to vote Leave, and the quarter of the population that was more British than English was much more likely to vote Remain. But the people who emphasise their English identity are also much less likely to support the Union. They would be happier to see Scotland and Northern Ireland go. They're most dissatisfied with the quality of their political representation and with their democracy, preferring to see English MPs making English laws. But at the same time, there is no discernible English nationalism as a political movement that compares with other political nationalisms. Those who are English and those who are English and British are generally more patriotic and much more likely to associate both identities with positive values than those who are British, not English. We don't have the comparable data to that original sliding scale I gave you for regional identities, but thanks to a very, very big 20,000-person BBC survey that was done last year, we can say a number of things about the interaction of local or regional and national identity in England. The first is that there is not a county or a region or a place in England where people's local attachment is stronger than their national identity. But it is a particular feature of English identity that it is also very strongly associated with a local or regional identity. So whilst a large number of the people who describe themselves as British, not English, don't say that a local identity is an important part of their makeup, the great majority of people who are English say that a local identity is also important, which in a sense is why somebody like me from Hampshire can be English and also identify strongly with Hampshire, and somebody from Yorkshire can be English but strongly insistent on saying that they're a Yorkshire person too. So we need to understand English identity as a multi-layered set of identities, and you can actually say that for many people, Englishness is a national identity built on rootedness in localities. And so in terms of the conference here, I think one of the really interesting things that museums might engage with is how do you explore the nature of those local identities and how do they contribute to that sense of national identity. And this runs through many different things, and I'm not one of those who thinks that folk music is actually at the heart of all this, because it's not, generally speaking. But it's quite interesting, because I come from Hampshire. We do not have songs about blackleg miners in Hampshire, for a very good historical reason. Complete lack of mines. But we've got lots of songs about shepherds and sailors and all the rest of it. So, in other words, you have a story which is as English as the places that have blackleg miners, but the telling of the story locally is different because the economy, the history, the society is different. Hope that's a few things to think about. Thank you.
So, thanks, John, Richard, the really thought-provoking talk so far. I wanted to begin mine by asking really the question, why does identity matter in the first place? I don't think we've actually considered that. Why are we even concerned with identity? And I think the psychological literature talks about the value that we attach to our inner selves and our individual recognition. But that's a very Western perspective on what identity is about. For many societies, identity is actually much more closely related to a more collective sense of belonging, and what we can also term as dignity. And I think that this idea of dignity is fundamental to identity. The idea that if one of my kind is dishonoured, then so I am dishonoured as well. And I think that's partly why this is such a salient concept at the moment. This collective understanding, I think, helps us to understand quite a lot of the social phenomena that we actually see going on in the UK today. For example, I think it can explain a little bit why numerous individuals have admitted that they voted to leave the EU in full knowledge that that would have material disadvantage to their own situations. Take back control, as far as I'm concerned, was a cry for recognition, a cry for dignity on the part of many communities, as much as it was anything to do with Brussels or Westminster or however else that played out. And so it's in this context that I think identity and belonging are crucial in relation to national, regional, and local identities. It's why national, regional, local identities become so important. But I think we also have to dig a bit deeper around theories of geographical identity, place attachment, and some of the psychogeography that talks of this. And identity and place attachment, I think, as John's just suggested, actually works on different levels. There's a lot of thinking about dwelling, and this sense of the place in which we are born, the place in which we live, and we form households, and we develop close and meaningful associations. That's one type of place attachment. But there's another type, which we're very familiar with, which is the fact that we're so mobile these days, and therefore it's this notion of what in the research they call elective belonging, choosing to actually form an attachment with a particular place that you might not have necessarily been born in. And in London's case, I think, Richard, you were talking precisely about this. Somewhere that you've recently moved to, somewhere perhaps you've just visited. That could be significant to you as well. And crucially, and this relates now to national identities, we often adopt place identities at much larger scales. National and regional identities tend to depend much less on our physical contact with particular places per se, but much more, as John suggested, on ideas of places and geographies and their associated institutions and landscapes and buildings and monuments and artifacts and activities and a whole range of other symbols and less tangible things that actually help us to form these kind of large-scale attachments to place. And as some of you might know, at the RSA, we have been producing, and we're currently in the throes of producing it for the third time, a heritage index, where we've sought to capture and to quantify over 100 different indicators of heritage in every single local authority, really with a view to helping that local authority area understand and articulate a sense of place for their communities, for their citizens. So what I think we learn from the academic literature on identity is that it's highly complex and nuanced. And when it comes to our geographical identities, these are very nested and very dynamic, and they depend a lot on our context. Where we say we come from very often depends on who actually is asking us the question in the first place, and it's wrapped up in this sense of dignity. And it's in these contexts that I feel notions of Englishness and Britishness are actually a significant distraction and abstraction for many, many people. Far more so than their attachment to their locality or their neighbourhood or their city or their town. And that's why I get quite irritated by the kind of scales that John was talking about, the so-called Mourinho scale, where we're asked fairly binary questions and presented false choices about, as you were, Englishness versus Britishness. It's a bit like asking whether your favourite colour is red or blue. What happens to people whose favourite colour is green? What happens to people who feel a bit purple on some days of the week? my assertion is that the Englishness, Britishness debate, which is really at the heart of so much of the academic study around identity at the moment, is actually a distraction. It's a debate largely played out in London and the South, and I say that as a northerner, and by a small and very noisy cohort of the liberal elite. That's not to say, as John has very articulately shown, that it doesn't have very real manifestations, particularly in the form of populist campaigns, far-right movements, the musings of E.P. Thompson fanatics. But I think all of this is to ignore a much, much more vibrant and interesting conversation about local and regional identity that we actually spend very little time thinking and talking about. And I think it's because of the preoccupation of the establishment with national identity that there's actually been far less research into local and regional identity. And where experiments have been taken, then the results are surprising. John's referred to the BBC survey. I'd draw your attention to work by the University of Sheffield, the University of Exeter, which contradicts that BBC stuff and says that actually people in Yorkshire, if asked the silly binary choice kind of question, will say they are more Yorkshire than they are English. People in Cornwall will say they are more Cornwall than they are English. And so there is some evidence out there that that local and regional identification is actually quite strong. I would offer a few reflections from the north of England, and to say that in the 25 years or so that I've lived in Manchester, civic pride has grown and grown during that time. There is, I think, an ongoing salience about notions of the north. And particularly since the whole idea of the Northern Powerhouse was floated by George Osborne, it wasn't then just a national, if you like, governmental idea. It's actually been embraced by communities and by businesses all across the North. And again, huge nuance within that. I mean, different parts of the North will have different views about it. There's a brilliant book by Dave Russell on Northern England and how it figures within the national imagination. And what he does is plot a series of waves over 3 centuries where Northern identity has risen and then fallen, risen and then fallen. And I would argue that we are once again entering something of an important Northern moment. I feel that the outworkings of the current impasse around Brexit and so on is almost inevitably going to be Scottish independence, and I think that Northern identification will then grow more and more on the back of that. It's also very interesting the way in which regional identity is often developed as a reaction against Englishness and Southern constructions of the idea of the North. And this reminds me of Edward Said's seminal work on Orientalism and the way in which colonized nations and communities learned to reinterpret and then subvert the identities that were imposed on them by colonial masters. So let me finish where I began. I don't think we should see identity as some kind of competition. I think any Mourinho-style question is actually the wrong question to ask. I think we would do far better in focusing on how local, regional, and national identities can be mobilized in order to restore a sense of dignity amongst those people who clearly feel that their collective identities have somehow been ignored or abandoned. And in this context, I would ask the question, what's the role of museums in once again celebrating a sense of place that helps people feel that they belong?
So 3 different introductions there, and thank you very much to our speakers for keeping to time so very effectively. Lots of food for thought: dignity, place-based relationships, importance of neighbourhoods, all sorts of things there. What we would like to do now is to ask you to think about this, and I just want to throw something else in the mix, because it seems to me that there's one of the challenges when moving between thinking about research findings to thinking about what happens in museums when we talk about identities is that whatever we put in the museum attains a particular kind of status and a particular kind of validation and authority. So if we're thinking about telling some of these stories, how does that translate in the worlds that you inhabit, in the institutions that you have? What would be some of the things you might be concerned about or feel excited about? What would be the particular challenges that you might face in trying to take some of that information and put it out there and share it with the public? So we're going to give you, say, 5 minutes or so just to talk to somebody next to you, come up with some thoughts and questions, and then we'll gather them in with the assistance of the roving mics. Over to you. Okay. I can hear lots of very animated chatter, which bodes well. I'm looking forward to the questions. So is there anyone who would like to start us off? Anyone who's got a question or an observation to kick us off with? Yes. Thank you. Do you want to say where you're coming from?
Can you hear me? Oh, hi. Hello, I'm Ellen Harrison. I head up public programming at Historic England. So this is a very interesting debate for us. We were just talking, and I think it's interesting how many hands went up to identify with British rather than English, that perhaps the data and the research is there if you look, but that perhaps people are nervous, particularly in this climate, to really talk about Englishness because it is so contentious in some areas. I wondered what you thought of that.
There is a nervousness, perhaps, but it is very odd, it seems to me, that there should be that nervousness. I mean, given that 4 out of 5 people in England feel strongly English, it is not the case that 4 out of 5 people in England are neo-Nazis. You know, it doesn't belong to the far right. And indeed, if you look at extremism and the far right in Britain, it is overwhelmingly British. From the British Union of Fascists to the National Front, to the British National Party, to Britain First, to British Revival. There was the English Defence League, which lasted a few years, but even the remnants of that, when they were absorbed into UKIP, tended to wave the Union Jack rather than the St George Cross. So there is this curious association of Englishness with the far right, which is belied by the evidence. And so actually the problem, we have to overcome this problem, that it's got this sort of reputation about it. But the reputation, I don't know how to put this given the way people's hands went up earlier, is largely amongst people who are British, not English. So the English don't have a problem with being English. Okay? It's people who are not English who have a problem with the English being English because they project this view of them. So I think we just need to say, look, I mean, of course it's a contested identity. Of course, you know, the data I said earlier, it shows there are clearly people who do, for example, insist it's a white identity. And it's battled over, even if the battle is going generally, from my point of view, in the right direction. But I think we just, actually, one of the things I think we have a responsibility to do is actually to say, no, actually this is an identity which is held by millions upon millions upon millions of our fellow citizens. They're very proud to be it. It doesn't mean they're anti-democratic. It doesn't mean they're from the far right. It doesn't mean they're any more racist than anybody else in our society. And that's something we just need to be prepared to say, I think, and there is sufficient evidence to deploy that.
As I think the only person on the panel, one of the 2 hands that went up to be English, you know, I've thought about this in various ways over the past few years. I increasingly attach myself to Englishness as an identity of place rather than an identity with a political structure. And in a strange way, and slightly ironic, in a slightly surprising way, my Englishness has become slightly stronger since the EU referendum, as I've found myself more attached to the place that I live in and less attached to a country which is going in the direction I worry about quite deeply. You know, I've seen in the past people have written about, and I've been noted that when the British Empire was out there, it was the British Empire, not the English Empire. The flag that colonised the world and committed all the terrible things that we talk about was the British flag, not the English flag. So I suppose it comes back to the balance between political identity and place identity. I regard Englishness as a place identity. I think it's very strong. It's a place I've always lived in. My family is actually Irish in terms of heritage. So, you know, I feel there's something about England and the place that people, that is amazing and beautiful and diverse in itself, that is perhaps easier for people to identify with. And for a lot of English people, I think that's what they're thinking of. They're not necessarily thinking of the monarch, of Parliament, of the institutions of state.
Do you want to come in?
The only thing I'd add to that is again, just on the kind of research and the methodological side of things, I do think that it's kind of overclaiming when we constantly focus on Englishness, because we only ever ask people about Englishness. So that's why we talk about it so much, if you see what I mean. And I think, so if we were asking people constantly about their local identity, their regional identity, we'd have so much more to say about that as well. And so that's an anxiety I've got. And then the other reflection is, and you know, I can't possibly claim to, you know, walk all the different streets of the north of England and know, you know, every pocket of the northeast and northwest and whatever. So, you know, I probably would be, with all of you, putting my hand up for British and then realising that, in actual fact, I'm not at all representative of the northern population. But in the circles in which I mix, and I do try and get out and speak to people different from me, but in the circles, nobody even talks about Englishness in the north. Nobody mentions, it's not part of a conversation, it doesn't appear in the newspapers, it's just not a thing. And so I just offer that as a reflection, again, anecdotally, of whether, you know, the national conversation that we like to have at a National Museums Association conference and in national circles is actually genuinely reflective of where a lot of people are up to. Even if when a survey question is put under their nose, they will answer the question whether they're English or British.
Just to add a museum perspective to it, I think one of the things I find interesting from looking at the history of national museums in the United Kingdom is that obviously we've got a National Museum of Wales, National Museum in Scotland, and National Museum in Ireland, and then obviously later Northern Ireland. But there was never a National Museum of England. There was a sort of suggested project which didn't happen, but it's always been that the national institutions in England represent Britain. So I think it's, I wonder sometimes whether this hesitance about Englishness is because there hasn't been a top-level national recognition of it for at least a century in the way that there has been in the other parts, in the other nations. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. You know, lots of people talk about, should we have a Museum of Britain, a Museum of England, whatever. I'm not advocating that, but it's just an observation about, I think, the way that some parts of the United Kingdom have had more public civic validation or recognition for a long time.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I've gone quiet now.
I was going to make a comment on your point, if I can.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just historically, we used to have an empire, Britain, right, and the institutions were imperial, and so we have an imperial state. And what has happened really, beginning from the 1920s, of course, with the partition of Ireland, but more recently through national devolution, has been the devolving of power away, not from really a British government, but from the imperial state. So what we have left in running England is what's left of the imperial state. We haven't rethought the English bit about England, which is one of the reasons that, sounds like Ed and I disagree, we actually completely agree that England is far too centralised in every way that it's run. And by and large, the people who have been in power in England have not been the people who feel particularly strongly English. And they've been quite happy to inherit this centralised state based in London and not think about the English question too much. But out there in the public, and I sort of agree with what Ed says, it's not people's upfront conversation. There is a sense of people feeling powerless and excluded and not listened to. And that's what's bubbling around behind these questions of identity. So it's partly trying to understand the historical moment we're at. And I would argue, not necessarily to build a great big building, but actually to learn historic England and wherever else, to learn stories of telling England's story again back to people who've not heard their story talked about for a long time would be really good.
Yeah, and I agree, and just again on the sort of point of agreement with John, I agree that is absolutely the thing that we need to do, and if it requires a National Museum of England to restore a sense of dignity, going back to my kind of what is the key question here is how do we restore people's sense of dignity, then I would be up for that. My question though is whether we've done our proper research to know that by telling English stories, by building a national museum for England, we would actually restore the dignity of the people in the north of England, where I don't think they care too much for Englishness. Yeah. Are there other things that we need to do in our local and regional museums, do you see what I mean, that would actually better help restore people's dignity rather than obsess about Englishness?
Yes. Sorry, Ian, we'll come back to you after that. Is that okay? Yeah.
Just put in my mind a thought. We haven't talked about class and Englishness, and is that what causes some hesitancy about people identifying as English or not? We'd be interested in your and anybody else's views on that.
Yeah, I don't think we actually have enough information about that. The observation I would make, and can I say, you always need to be clear when you're sort of deducing stuff from data rather than saying you've got the raw data to prove it, is that if you look at the people who are English, and say they're English, one of the things they tend to have in common is they tend to live in places that used to be much more central to national life than they are today. And that includes quite a broad range in class terms. So it can include people in the former industrial towns that used to be the heartbeat of the economy. But they also would include quite a lot of people, for example, in southwest England, in areas where the sort of village life that I grew up in the 1950s has largely disappeared. And the pubs aren't there anymore, and there's not a rural economy like there used to be. And there's a lot of people who are left. So there is a class element to it. But I also, and I think the expressions of it are different in different social classes, but I think there's also something about people's relationship with power and the sense of not being in the center of life. And perhaps, and it can be more intense amongst the older generations, that they feel it more sharply because they either have an actual memory or a folk memory of when people like them were more important. That's all I think that's where we need to be looking to explore these sorts of issues.
Not a lot to add to that. I mean, in the London data I was looking at earlier, interestingly, amongst the sample of English identity in London, there's not a great deal of difference between different classes within London, which may suggest that those people are feeling nearer to that centre of power and don't have that sense of marginalisation that working class people in other parts of the country might have.
And it ties very much with what John said a moment ago about devolution as well, and you know, that sense of powerlessness. So you know, we talk at the RSA about not just belonging and self-esteem, but also about efficacy and agency and the way in which that works alongside it. And I think working class people have both lost that sense of belonging and esteem, but also lost that sense of efficacy and agency. I guess the question then is, so how do you nurture that? On what basis do you rebuild and reconstruct and support that? Is it London, is it region, is it national? I think that's precisely the issue that we've got to explore, and you're in fantastic situations in museums up and down the country to explore that.
Ian, we should come to you.
Ian Watson from Tyne-Wear Archives and Museums. I worry about some of this stuff, and I think it's perhaps I'm a bit sad worrying about it, but some of it seems important. So in how we tell some of those stories. So it was interesting hearing what Richard was saying about some of the BAME communities in London who identified with the very small areas. And I think certainly what a lot of us see in regional museums is how people do identify with a very local area. And it's not just the north that does that. I think that happens right across the country as I talk to people. I think what I'm interested in is the extent to which it's useful or helpful for us both in society and in how we present things in museums to create, I think sometimes we do create regional identities. So, you know, the classic example I always give is if you get the train from Sheffield to Derby, and it's half an hour on the train, something like that, doesn't feel very far. Tony, you know, I've gone from the Northern Powerhouse to the Midlands Engine, but yet Sheffield and Derby don't feel any different to me. As maybe they are. There's lots of subtle differences I'm not aware of, but. You know, they both seem like, you know, post-industrial cities that face similar challenges. In industry desperately important in both of them. So why then would I create that Northern Powerhouse? Is it helpful to us to do that, or does it just Is it just a way of fracturing the nation? And in museums, as we're telling the story, should we be celebrating that parochialism and division, or should we be, focusing more on, trying to tell what is different individual, which probably is going to be local rather than, because so many things are common across large chunks of the country. So do we stay at a local level, and if we get into regional, do we then just end up putting regions antithetically against each other?
Is it going to be more divisive than beneficial?
First of all, I would absolutely affirm the sense of local being really fundamentally important. So I think we've all three of us said that whether it's a local that is rooted in Englishness, whether it's a local as in London boroughs or pre-boroughs, or whether it's local as in the different parts of the north of England. I think if I had more time, I would have said a little bit more about Northern identity. And there's a brilliant book by Paul Morley called The North and Everything in It, which I'd really suggest people have a look at, because what's brilliant about it is it doesn't actually tell you what it means to be Northern at all. It's completely postmodern in its kind of construction and development, and it could be anything. And I think he cites Ian Brown, who says the North is not where you're from, it's where you're at. And this whole idea that it's very difficult, in the same way as with Englishness, it's very difficult to actually construct and define what that is. I would say the things that you do in your museums that are very local, and that particularly engage and support the participation of communities that wouldn't otherwise be involved in thinking about heritage and so on, that for me should be absolutely fundamental. The rest of it is icing on the cake, whether it's about Englishness, whether it's about regional identity, what that regional identity looks like and why, whether it's, where the boundaries might be and so on and so forth. I think, we all have our own political with a small p projects as to why some of those geographies, some of those kind of more abstract creations of identity at that much larger scale become important or not. And I think we just need to be honest about that. So if you wanted me to sit here and make a case for northernness and why I think that's important and why that northern powerhouse geography is important, I could do that. But I think, it's to kind of miss the point. And, I see the north of England ultimately as a political project for people who are disenfranchised to get greater devolution around key powers. But that's a project, do you see what I mean? And whether people buy into that or not, we can have a big debate about that.
We are nearly out of time. Would you like to make a final comment in response to that?
Just to follow on from that, and without repeating the local national thing, local and national to me are important. And I'll just leave you with this thought. Scottish identity is seen as a pretty inclusive identity. British identity is seen as much more inclusive. And although things are moving, in my view, the right way in English identity, British and Scottish identity had that engagement with political leadership and the state. People thought it was important. I think that is also important for English identity, because although I think Englishness is sort of finding its way in the right direction, whether it's doing so fast enough is a big question. 20 years from now, England will be 35% visibly non-white. 10, 15 years after that, this will no longer be a majority white country. So have we actually managed to develop a sense of identity that people feel comfortable with for the scale of the demographic change, and this is not about future immigration. It's partly past immigration. A lot of it's to do with people falling in love and having mixed-race children and all the rest of it very, very quickly. So that's the change that's going to take place. I do worry that we don't yet have national stories that have equipped people to feel entirely comfortable, and I'm talking about the white majority here, to feel entirely comfortable with that sort of change, which is going to happen. And nothing can be done that's going to stop it, not that you would want to stop it. And therefore, I think the role of museums in engaging, not just in a historical sense of what England used to be, but why it is, because we had an empire, and that's why we have the demographics that we do now and the patterns of to tell those stories so that people actually see this as part of a positive, continuous strand and not a sharp break with the past. And I think that's the challenge. And I think museums, everybody involved, any sort of cultural work, has got to say we have a responsibility to be part of that.
I think from the point of view of focusing on the London example again, one of the things that the three mayors have sought to do in different ways over the past 20 years is to create that London identity. And London perhaps is, like Scotland, like Britain, is a place where there is a political identity as well as potentially a regional identity. And I think part of that is responding to some of the specific challenges London has, that we're a city with dramatic changes in population, very diverse, relatively high levels of social cohesion, quite low levels of social integration. So it's a relatively easygoing city, but it's not a very integrated city. And I think mayors feel that they need to create that slightly stronger attachment to London that can bring those communities together. I think the risk is, of course, that London identity looks like something exclusive, something other from the rest of the UK. And I think perhaps the challenge is, A, to make London identity an identity that feels it gives access to English or British or wider identities, but also that London needs to, our reports have said this very strongly, needs to act more like a capital city as well as a global city, and to give everyone ways of accessing. The current mayor talks a lot about London is open, very much talking to that Brexit we didn't do it sort of audience that London needs to reach out to internationally. But talking about London is yours, talking about London being an English and a British city, which the mayor has done at times, is perhaps also a priority, so that we sort of start to join those bits together.
There's a very practical issue there about cost, isn't there, for people to be able to get to London, to feel it is their capital city. I think we've probably just scratched the surface here, and there's so much more we could have talked about, but I do want to keep to time to respect the other sessions. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you to everyone who participated. Hopefully, even if you didn't get to ask your question, it's given you food for thought, which you can take on through the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.